Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to GeekWatch, a subsidiary of the monastery, the open bar of the internet. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a couple good brothers here in the temple. I usually do the counting gag, but it slipped my mind this time. In the red corner, the man. Actually, you know what? You go last. The co-host of the Adventures of the Monk and the Monarch, who him and I recently finished an episode dealing with a certain boogeyman. And
hoping that's going to be up tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And no, we're not talking about the wrestler who lied about his age. The good brother Monarch. And in the redder corner, the man of 1,000 runes, the CEO of Zadari Enterprises, and the bane of my fucking existence, good brother Xanatrix.
This just in, Zadari Enterprises is designing a giant mecha with a large slashed green M on it. We're calling it the Monster Kaiju Fighter. Come and get us, Monster Energy!
As long as that's part of the name, I'm good.
Oh. I mean, truth be told, I think Monster Energy should be sued for impersonating a drinkable substance.
They only had one drinkable substance, in my opinion. That was the Dub Edition cans. They were actually tasty.
I never had those.
You missed out. They were actually good.
I probably did. Then again, the only time I enjoyed Mountain Dew was Distortion.
Live wire all the way.
Pitch Black, yo. And Pitch Black, too. They're both really good.
Although Spark wasn't that bad, but I might be biased because Lemonade.
For a Minnesotan, you have a lot of Southern boy tastes.
Yeah, but how many? I don't think you know any Southern boys who would eat lemons straight.
There are a few. They live in Florida, though.
Yeah, but that's Florida, man.
It's still the South!
You are technically correct. The best kind of correct.
But rails.
Yeah. So, I'd say this will be the first reconstruction we've done in a handful of weeks. It is not the first. I don't think it's the first reconstruction that we've done since the Ruby experiment.
No, I think we reconstructed something else in the interim, but I can't remember what. I could probably look it up.
Let's see. Oh yeah, there was GoldenEye Rogue Agent. That was the last one
yes.
we did.
Yes.
And once again, we're dipping into the video game pond. So, for a good number of years, BioWare was the studio that could do no wrong, until they did, and broke the internet in the process. But as I understand it, the humble origins of Dragon Age was them wanting to take what they had built with Knights of the Old Republic into an IP that they would wholly own. Irony considering the whole EA thing, but that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Yes.
And it seemed that the idea was to do a high fantasy that has a whole lot of that is certainly on the bloody end, with some very blatant cues leaning a bit Irish more than anything else. Irish / Scottish. No, just Irish. I was gonna say there's a bit of Scottish in some of the mythos, but not really.
It'd mostly be in names.
Yeah, most of the aesthetic feels like it's trying to evoke Ireland. Uh, at least with Origins. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the way magic and the way demons work is a little bit veering close to a certain litigious game company.
I mean, the litigious game company can't claim mythoses that are that universal.
Yeah, I'm just saying when it comes to the types of demons, um, the there could be some parallels, but not enough for said company to get sue happy. Mostly because I'd like to think that they learned their lesson after they tried to pick that legal fight with Blizzard all those years ago, but you know how it is.
I mean, we don't call them the most litigious for no reason.
Hmm. And I know some people are going, why are you bringing up Wizards of the Coast? I'm not. As legit, we only recently started calling their shit the world's most litigious role-playing game, or the world's most litigious fantasy game. There's been a bigger culprit on that front for decades.
Yo.
But that being said, um, the original Dragon Age was early. The earliest development was actually during the Xbox era, and then migrated over to the 360. There was a bit of unfortunate timing because it showed up after the original Mass Effect, what would pioneer things like dialogue wheel and quote unquote moral choices. Whereas the original Dragon Age really felt like it still had a quite a bit of the DNA from KOTOR. KOTOR 1 specifically because well, I'd say almost every character aside from the Grey Warden can be in some way analogous to one of the characters from Knights of the Old Republic. Some of them in a bit more of a roundabout way, but the DNA is still there. And of course,
So who's Karth?
who's Carth Onasi? Mm, as much of a stretch as it is to say, Alistair.
I know. I was trying to make a point of that the parallels are not going to be as parallel as people think they are.
No, if I was to say who's the say Zalbar of it, um, it's Sten.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm fully aware is a massive stretch, but you can see the connections somewhat.
Sorta. Yeah.
Mm-mm. But then of course with the success of that we had the expansion Awakening as well as a handful of other DLCs which some of which were a bit controversial, namely the Stone Prisoner, because of how they advertised it by having an NPC in the game that was a glorified ad for the thing.
Yeah, I never got that experience. Mostly because well, I played Dragon Age Origins and Awakening with all DLC on PC.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of another game at that time that just blatantly advertised DLC in game like that.
Yeah, and surprisingly, they never did it again. Can't imagine why. But of course, of course, the even with the DLCs that were put in, those they're ultimately one-offs, except for Awakening, which is a direct follow-up. Although this is where you end up having the problem of how do you directly follow up when you have a character when your protagonist can go so many different routes.
Including dying.
Mm-hmm. And this is also the reason why I think we talked about this a while back, but these kind of logistical issues I think are why the Your Choices Matter thing stopped being advertised as much in games.
Probably.
Because if you end up making a sequel to a game where your choices matter, all of those major choices have to be implemented somehow in the story, which means you end up doubling, tripling, or possibly quadrupling the amount of work you do.
Ah, yes. The issue we saw between Mass Effect 1, 2, and the other games we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm. But it is still an issue, and that. Well, if you want an even more blatant example, consider why considers the issue of fighting game sequels, and how eventually things just migrated into a set story instead of doing an arcade mode where everybody has their own ending.
Except for Guilty Gear, where all other endings within arcade mode are just Axel Lowe experiencing other timelines, and then one of them is picked to be the real ending for the next game.
At least that one's a nice little workaround.
It's an ass pull, is what it is.
It's an ass pull, but it's an ass pull that is still within the boundaries of its world.
This is true.
Which is why it doesn't bug me as much, because it's already well established that Axel keeps jumping around through time.
Yep. And there's even a dark version of him called Raven.
Mm-hmm.
But rails
getting back on the rails, it was inevitable that we'd be getting a sequel. But the thing is, EA wanted to essentially have BioWare in charge of all things RPG, to the point where they fused them with another studio they had under their belt, Mythic. This was referred to by one guy as the EA Bear Hug, and the idea was to have 3 projects from them all launching in the holidays of 2011. Dragon Age 2, Mass Effect 3, and The Old Republic.
Because that couldn't ever go wrong, right?
No, and then we get a surprise Pikachu face when it ends up going wrong. Mass Effect 3 gets delayed. Dragon Age 2 comes out to mixed results, and The Old Republic is still kicking for an MMO, but it feels like the MMO part has been vastly dialed back, and it was supposed to be. They spent $200 million to try and make it a WoW killer. It couldn't do it because
not even FF14 tried to be a WoW killer. They just tried to be a good game.
And oddly enough, ended up being that.
After some initial trouble.
A Realm Reborn certainly has been that, but I'd say it's a case of, as I frequently say, never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake.
Yep.
All that they had to do was not fuck up, and they'd get people coming in who were disgruntled at their opponent fucking up. And I know somebody's gonna say, but what about Stormblood? As bad as Stormblood's badness is debatable in terms of its degree. At worst, I can say it's controversial.
Stormblood wasn't really bad. It was just different, and parts of it might have been a little lackluster to what people were expecting. But when you look at the games on a spectrum of like how people rate them or each of the expansions, the order I see most is from least to most. ARR, Stormblood, Endwalker, and then a tie between Heavensward and Shadowbringers.
And even with that, as controversial as that was, it didn't generate nearly the amount of hate that Shadowlands did.
Although we do have to admit that recently WoW has been doing well again with Dragonflight.
So far, but forgive me if I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it's in Dragon Age 2 that we wanted to focus, because there were a lot of ideas that it presented that I thought fascinating. I was disappointed when they didn't manifest. And then I understood why they didn't manifest once I got the full story of things. For starters, this was a rush job. Officially, its development time was 1.5 years. In actuality, the real production was 9 months. That is not enough time to make a CRPG of this scale.
Now, for anyone here who has either forgotten or hasn't played Dragon Age 2, just to illustrate how obviously this game was rushed, there is a mini-map that will be reused several times. Each instance, there will be sections you can see on the mini-map you can walk, but you can't actually go that way because they didn't adjust the maps for every area. So you'd see, hey, there's a hallway here. No, there's not. But it's on the mini-map. Nope, it's not there. Almost every map in the game this happens, because it's the same handful of maps that are reused for every dungeon. That is how rushed this job was.
Mm-hmm. So, not only that, but especially in Act 3, bugs. Lots of bugs. Lots of bugs, and I think I need to turn on my heater because it be freezing up in here. But even more than that, one of the things that really ended up hurting was, of course, the vaunted story. I know people have taken their shots at the whole BioWare magic thing in the wake of Anthem, but there was the controversy with Jennifer Hepler apparently not even playing the games she was writing about, which led to her getting a lot of flack, to the point where people started calling her Hamburger Hepler.
Yep. The scenarios that she wrote were pretty terrible compared to everything else around her.
And because this was the 2010s, she decided to play victim about the thrashing she was getting.
Yep. Proto stirrings of a certain 2014 movement in the making.
Mm-hmm.
But for those of you who don't understand how bad Miss Hepler's writing was, we refer back to Dragon Age Origins, and we refer back to what is the most commonly complained about section of the game, the Deep Roads.
Yep.
She was the primary scenario writer for the Deep Roads.
Mm-hmm.
So Miss Hepler was not a very good writer.
Yeah. Now, the other problem is a lot of the story, especially later on, is trying to do the both sides have a point, but the way it's done is falling into the same traps that often happen with extremism, where you're either all in on the cause or you're a traitor. And that ends up happening a lot with the various factions to a point with Act 2, but especially in Act 3 of the original story. And because of that, what ends up happening is both sides end up acting like douchebags, and I hate both of them.
And at one point, you just wish Hawk would tell both of them to shove off.
And the problem is you don't have that option. It wants to put you on the rails for a specific thing, which I don't have a problem with a story being on rails on paper. The problem ends up manifesting when you try and have it be on rails while claiming that the audience is making the story.
If you're going to be that blatant about how the story changes, do it like visual novels do. One choice changes your path.
Or at the very least, pick a damn lane. Because that approach of it's moving to this one conclusion, even though the players are the ones making the story through their choices, that's trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Yep.
And of course, the rush job also comes in with some of the UI design where there's a whole lot of unused space in the UI, to put it bluntly, and a lot of something that I thought really stuck out to me as far as the rush job is, you look at a lot of the concept art and a lot of the promotional materials, and it gives this vibe of a very almost sword and sorcery type approach, as opposed to the Irish high fantasy of Origins.
Mm-hmm.
I might be reading too much into that, but consider the character design of Hawk.
Yeah.
In all the promotional material, he or she ends up looking far more like something I would see out of not Robert E. Howard, but maybe Joe Abercrombie.
Okay, I can see it.
Now, we've talked about this in the past. There's multiple forms of fantasy, and a lot of people seem to think that there's only one.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, there was already some leaning into sword and sorcery in Origins, but if you just look at the art with Dragon Age 2, it really feels like they wanted to lean far more into that with how Kirkwall is set up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Kirkwall feels like that kind of Fertile Crescent style city that you would see in a lot of Howard's work. You know, where the legal, the questionably legal, and the very much illegal all convalesce into one city.
Mm-hmm. A mecca of civilization.
Mm-hmm. Which is saying something, given his not so high opinion of civilization.
That's why I said it with disdain, Monk.
But this is where and truth be told, one other thing that annoyed the hell out of me is the protagonist having a family who only seems to be there to be slowly killed off as the story progresses.
It's an entire family in a fridge.
I find the fridge thing to be a bit overused, especially by bad actors. But in this case, I'm not going to dispute that.
Well, it fits the trope, mm-hmm, as per TV tropes.
Yeah.
So.
But with all that said, let us have a go. Now, before we get into the meat of things, I will note this. There is an easy solution to this notion of, we need something out quickly, so we don't have a whole lot of time for something as big as Origins. All right, here's counterpoint: an episodic RPG.
It had already been done by that time. We had it through the Dot Hack series alone.
Mm-hmm.
as the primary example.
And that one, of course, .hack reuses a bunch of maps, but it does so with a purpose.
I mean, you're imitating being part of an MMO, so yeah.
So this we are going to be building it around a three episode setup. The first episode is Exodus, which is your early days in Kirkwall. The second episode is Shadow of the Arashok, where you're starting to move up in the world, and the focus is on the conflict with the Qunari. The third is Faith and Fire, which deals with the conflicts between the the Circle of Magi and the Templars, which is something that's always been present in Dragon Age. So why not take advantage?
Yup.
But in terms of the gameplay thing, around this time, BioWare was futzing about whether or not they wanted to do action or wanted to do pause and command approach. And with Origins and with this, they tried to do both. Although we have our own beef because of the fact that all the people who bitched about gambits in Final Fantasy 12 had the complete opposite thing to say about tactics.
Yeah, all you assholes who said a Final Fantasy game playing itself wasn't any fun, then took advantage of the tactics system in at very least Origins to set up your 3 Blood Mage and Warrior Tank Blood Battery. And yes, I know it's every one of you fuckers setting up this specific fucking automation because it was the most useful in the entire fucking game. You can walk through the highest difficulty with it, and I do mean walk through.
Mm-hmm. And we are not besmirching anybody for doing it. We are simply asking for a little consistency.
Yeah, we're besmirching you for being fucking hypocrites.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, I'm not. There is, of course, the possibility that some folks who were working with the tactics system just weren't aware of it being in 12 because they didn't play it. This was during that dumbass time where there was where media was trying to foster this East versus West rivalry.
And then, of course, there's the soy boys versus the X-Bones that have been going on for fucking ever.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck y'all for that, by the way. Console wars are a shit.
Console wars or like edition wars are cringe.
Look, I don't mind taking part in a console war, just not with people who are taking it that seriously. That's where shit gets weird.
But I think if I'm being honest, when I look at the way Dragon Age 2 was presented, as well as the direction, as well as the fact that BioWare was wanting to go more and more into an action game approach, anyways. I don't see a reason why Dragon Age 2 had to go with the same setup, aside from it's what they had with a limited time. But in this hypothetical, we don't have to worry about a time crunch. So, and since we'd be doing this as an episodic approach, I honestly think leaning into action-based instead of command-based would be a natural step.
Mm-hmm.
Now, am I saying going full character action like we did with the Jade Empire 2 experiment? Not necessarily. I do think. Actually, I'd say if there's any good example of the action approach I'd like to take, probably a simplified version of something like Dragon's Dogma.
Good shit. I love Dragon's Dogma.
I didn't play too much of that game, but yeah, I think a similar approach would have benefited Dragon Age pretty well.
Especially since in both cases you have the fighter, mage, rogue trinity. As much, although I will admit it did kind of bug me that that dual wielding became a rogue exclusive thing.
Yeah. I
That's
didn't
just
get that
people.
choice.
That's just people being stupid.
So to that particular end, I'm in favor of not having a preferred weapon pair for fighter and rogue in this hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
Each one has access to to hand weapon, great weapon, and archery. And of course, with when it comes to mages, the approach I'd take is just different magic schools. That being said, the chain system that rogues had, I'm perfectly fine with that, and I liked the whole cross class effect that was a glorified proc for a lot of the abilities in Dragon Age 2 as a good way to foster working with your whole party. And I talked about this before we went live, but one game that could provide a good template for what we'd want to do leaning into this action approach is Trinity Souls of Zilal. You know, in that one you have an action game. You are switching between multiple characters, and each one of them has their own use, their own niche. Now, before we can even get into that, there is the matter of what we do with the Grey Warden of Ferelden, or the Hero of Ferelden, depending on which version you're hearing from it. The big question is, did he or she survive at the end of Origins?
The answer we've come to is yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He survived. The approach that I'm thinking is this. He survived. He ended up going through the portal with Morrigan. And Alistair ended up becoming king.
I say that he survived and only did the ritual with Morrigan. Alistair ended up becoming king, and because I remember that when we first started talking about this, I insisted on it, and it was the trade-off you had to give me, but Leliana best girl, so fuck you.
She's fine.
Leliana best girl, so
Well,
fuck y'all.
He didn't in this version. He didn't go through the portal out of any sort of affection, but more of making sure that she isn't doing something stupid.
I mean, having a kid so it can have the power of an archdemon without it actually being an archdemon is I would consider that pretty stupid.
Yeah. But I would still want to keep the idea of this being the whole story being recollected from Varric being interrogated by Cassandra.
Yeah. That was a great touch the game had, I thought.
I know this is not the first time that I've seen that kind of thing because, well, we saw it a few years beforehand with Final Fantasy X. And there's also the usual suspects, but I've mentioned my issue with the usual suspects. And of course, if I want to go even further back, there's stuff like Hero or Rashomon. Although Varric wasn't exactly an unreliable narrator, except for the very first scene.
Varric is a 85% reliable narrator. Just understand it's going to be embellished.
Yeah. But
it's why I was sad there was never a sex scene in the game with Varric like the others, just because they'd have told it from his perspective.
Yeah.
It would have been great.
But one of the key things is in the actual game, Varric's narration barely shows up.
Yeah.
I think with this, that narration shows up a lot more often, and I'd actually want to lean into the story being told almost like a comic book. Now, I'm not saying rip off Max Payne, but if you're gonna steal from the best. Especially since the reason the whole comic panel thing was done with Max Payne was as a way to cut down, since they couldn't do full on cutscenes in the original. And hell, they were so paper thin that a lot of the characters in those comics were played by friends and family. But I do think that one of the key motifs should be Hawk and his or her family. The thing is that depending on whether or not you pick to being a mage or being a warrior or a rogue, there's one of two backgrounds you have. If you pick mage, you're an apostate. If you pick warrior or rogue, you were a soldier during the Battle of Ostagar. But of those two, but if I'm being honest, of those two, I can't. The promotional material had a mage Hawk, and I'm debating whether or not that's the one we'd use as canon, because keep in mind with the limited scope, the idea of doing full class pickups is not something that we'd have the option to. Actually, I just realized a better idea. Hawk is the only character in the group that can go classless in this hypothetical.
Okay.
In other words, they have the widest talent trees.
Okay. I can see that.
On the other hand, your companions who are rooted around a class are going to have talent trees in that class that you don't have access to. So, say you might have access to a couple types of magic, the main three weapon types, or the main four weapon types, if I want to get technical, and that's it. Putting aside any specializations that you may take as you develop.
Yeah, that way you can build a party that you like the specializations thereof, especially if there are certain characters you want with you all the time. And then specialize your character to mix between to act as the bridge between them.
Because when you have a 4-person party, which means you're going to have one. If you're doing a 3-class setup with a 4-person party, you're going to have one class doubled up. With this approach, you essentially you can have a wild card and one of each. Plus, the other reason that I'd want to go semi-classless with Hawk in this situation is to foster replay. Now, since we're doing episodic, each of the episodes aren't going to be as long, so there's an incentive to play it with a different build. And even if length isn't a situation, plenty of people will play a Souls-like with a different build or a build challenge, and we're kind of dipping into that narrative.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Now the prologue had the destruction of Lothering and their move to Kirkwall, which is there isn't a whole lot that I'd want to change when it comes to that.
Mhm.
Uh, although I will laugh that Aveline's husband is named Wesley.
Shut up, Wesley.
And I would say, because the big thing that happens is the prologue is basically your tutorial. You fight a few darkspawn, you get your first companion, and you lose your first companion, and then you d- and then you end up meeting Flemeth, who helps you get to Kirkwall.
Mhm.
Uh, but I don't want to. But the prologue did the first killing off one of the party members, and then you end up losing a second one due to Darkspawn Taint, and I feel like that's doubling down on shock deaths way too early.
Way too early and way too much.
Because I do think that uh, if I'm being honest, the only member of the only member of the Hawk family who should be um who should be who should be not appearing is Malcolm, aka i.e. Hawk's father.
Hmm.
But the mother, the but Bethany, Leandra, Carver, Gamlin, and Charade should all be present in some form. I'm just not a fan of cheaply killing off characters,
Yeah.
because I do think a driving force should be Hawk wanting to maintain their family in this very unforgiving place that is Kirkwall. And I will admit I did like the way Kirkwall was sectioned off and almost became a bit of an urban fantasy approach. That I was perfectly fine with. It is unfortunate that not enough time is spent making the city feel alive, and I'm not saying go Ubi box with it, obviously, but I think the approach that should be taken when it comes to the identity of Kirkwall is acknowledging this is as much of a character as any party member. I know I'm dipping into familiar territory because we said this exact same thing with Republic City in the Korra reconstruction.
Hmm.
But if we're going to be spending 90% of our time in this city, then yeah, I think fleshing it out is going to be vital.
Yeah.
That's and it's not even something that would need to be done by having a open world city. I'm not expecting Night City or anything like that. But you have different districts to Kirkwall. Just expand on that. Now, one of the one of the other choices that you end up having is because of how hard it is to actually get into the city. You can either spend a year working for the Red Iron Mercenaries or working with Athenril's smugglers. But that particular choice doesn't really mean anything. So I think if I'm being honest, that's one of the things I would end up dropping.
Hmm.
Just be just be or at least the choice of it, and just say you worked with a group of smugglers for a year.
Either that or make some like actual consequences for picking one or the other.
Yeah, but there really
But
isn't.
yeah,
I can't think of I can't think of enough of a reason for there to be consequences.
yeah,
So my approach is just nix it.
yeah.
Now that being said, as far I know, in the actual game they completely time jump that year. I wouldn't do that. I'd end up using that as an extension of the tutorial stuff, especially
Hmm.
since you're gonna have access to Hawk is gonna have access to multiple types of skills, and to that end, I do think that both Hawk and Bethany are both apostates and both twins. So double cursed.
Double cursed.
Mm-hmm. However, as far and as far as far as the whole thing of Flemeth being resurrected through that amulet, I'm perfectly fine with that because, well, as part of Morgan's whole deal, you had to kill Flemeth anyways. So
Hmm.
why so
Yeah.
and she seemed very cool with the idea of fighting you for Morgan's freedom. Probably because she knew she had an insurance policy. But of course, this is where when it comes to the companions, I think one question is should all of the companions be unlocked by the end of the first act?
Hmm.
I want to lean on yes here.
Sounds like a better idea to me. That way you have a chance to adjust
Yeah.
to the game as you slowly build up your
Yeah.
companions throughout the first act.
There's
And you
also that frustration of like the late game edition, especially in something like this where we're building up somebody to kind of work with the party you're making.
Mm-hmm.
And now suddenly here's this other guy that gets tossed. And it's like, all right, what do I do with this guy now?
And what the
It's always a problem.
whoever you bring in last ends up having the least amount of time for characterization.
So yeah, I think by the end of Act 1, you should have all characters assembled.
Yeah.
yeah.
Um. When it, the an issue that I end up having with a lot of the companions is that a lot of them can be summed up in can their personality and their motivations can be summed up in a
Yeah.
single word. Or a single themed word, I should say. Whereas you look at characters throughout RPGs, and that's not
Yeah.
exactly the case.
I would chalk that up to, again, we've already talked, this game was kind of a rush job.
Yeah, but this to that end, I'd like to go into the different companions and how they end up getting unlocked. Um, as far as and I'm gonna start from top to bottom. The first, of course, being Anders, and I would s- I would s- I would say that how Anders ends up joining up is in his case the his whole thing is he's an apostate. He's a former Grey Warden. He was in the whole thing with Awakening, and he ends up sharing a headspace with the Spirit of Justice, who the way they had it set up was that because of his feelings about Templars, Justice got warped into vengeance and occasionally possesses him. If I'm being honest, that's the idea of that sort of possession. I don't think that would be the best approach to go with, simply because of the fact that you can excuse him being an idiot whenever he does something stupid. If I were to rebuild Anders, I would actually end up using Johnny Blaze as a template.
See, to a degree, I actually don't mind how they handled Anders outside of just the whole story feeling a bit rushed and condensed. I do like the idea that like his own hatred eventually does start to warp the Justice. I think thematically it works. It's just it was executed very poorly.
The approach that I'd rather take is Justice sees things in very black and white terms, whereas and doesn't quite understand the notion that things are a bit gray. If he sees a wrong, he immediately wants to right it, regardless if writing that wrong ends up making things worse. I'd say that's a sufficient conflict between Anders and Justice. Basically, they technically need each other, but the approach causes conflict between them.
Mm-hmm.
There's no need for him to turn into vengeance in that sense. It's more of his interpretation of justice is so rigid that it creates problems.
Yeah. It really depends if you want to go with kind of the route they did, where Anders and Justice were effectively becoming one person, or if we're going to keep them as like distinct entities.
I would rather keep them distinct.
Yeah.
To the point where I'd have Justice occasionally having dialogue with you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
if we're keeping them distinct, I think that's definitely the way to go. Then.
And in fact, I'd say the good way to have the first encounter with him is, because this is where I'm going to bring in one of the other firsts, that being Aveline, who obviously you meet in the prologue, and she very much has a. They try and portray her as a policewoman kind of approach, which I'm perfectly fine with, but there's not a whole lot more to that in the way that it's presented. I'd say for her, it should be the focus should be a bit of, because she has a protector's mindset, but I wouldn't change too much with her. Just have it that the reason she has a protective mindset is due in part to having to kill her husband. It was a mercy killing because he was tainted, but he was succumbing to the Darkspawn taint, but that doesn't change the fact that she killed her husband. I hope I'm making sense so far.
There you are.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, by the start of Act 1, she ends up becoming captain of the guard after ousting the corrupt captain who was present at Kirkwall. Because, well, Kirkwall is a mecca of civilization, as you put it, Zan.
A mecha of civilization.
Yeah, now the because because of the because of the approach of having her be captain of the guard, you can she can be both a companion, but also use that as, to say, I can't help you out for that, but I can bring in one of the guard to help you out. As a way to have the guard present, but not, or her character sheet present, but not actually her present.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, killing two birds with one stone.
Mm-hmm.
But the approach I could see as far as introducing Anders is there's been a string of guard murders that she's been stonewalled in investigating, because obviously the people who may know about it isn't aren't gonna talk to the guard, they because they're thinking they might be next.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out Anders is the one who's doing it, because each of the guards that he's been killing were corrupt in some form. Like I said, I'm cribbing notes from Ghost Rider.
Not surprising.
Once again, if you're gonna steal from the best, and a lot of the supernatural end of '90s Marvel, I was always a fan of growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Especially stuff like Ghost Rider and Tomb of Dracula. To Hannibal King to a certain extent as well, but he didn't really show up in his own stuff all that much. But getting back on the rails, um, the when it comes with Bethany, they in canon they had her as Hawk's younger sister,
Mm-hmm.
but I honestly think that instead of going with younger sister, as we mentioned before, it's not a case of younger or older; they're twins.
Okay.
Um, Carver, on the other hand, I'd say Carver would be older than Hawk. I just think there's more potential in dealing with in Hawk trying to be this leader while having to conflict with an older brother.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, then we have Fenris, who was supposedly made as them having a tongue in cheek joke to quote unquote JRPG protagonist. In that regard, he's kind of a failure. The the idea Fen Now Fenris's background, that being of a escaped slave from Tevinter, who has lyrium infused tattoos all over his body. I don't mind that background, but the problem is they went with the whole thing of he hates mages because of his time as a slave, but they end up like a lot of things blowing that up to the point of parody.
I could not stand Fenris. Like,
We don't talk about Fenris in this household.
my sister loves him. I don't know why.
Maybe we'll never know.
But the approach that also it is a I'm guessing the reason why they claim was that Fenris was supposed to be some sort of parody of JRPG protagonists is white hair and a great sword. Which if that sounds weak, that's because it is. Also, it is kind of funny that there was supposed to be a book focused on him but that was canceled when David Gator left BioWare.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem that he has is the same problem that a lot of characters in the in this entry have of focus of kind of Flanderization.
Mm-hmm. Where they're taken to the extremes of their most noticeable attributes. For those of you who don't know what Flanderization it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things. It works well if you're doing a parody or making a joke, but when you're trying to get someone to take that guy seriously, kind of stops working.
And I know that I know that in the game his class was warrior, but I'm sorry, everything about him just yells rogue.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just the the design, his background, his toolkit. It doesn't say it doesn't say warrior to me, even though some of the concept art tries to have him have this elven barbarian look.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't suit him. And the even though and truth be told, there's because of the way skill trees work, there's nothing to say we can't have a rogue that also has the arcane warrior tree as his specialization. Like we're not limited in that sense.
Yeah.
Since modders are going to do that kind of thing anyways, I know I did in Origins.
Yep.
But I would say in his case the way that Fenris is introduced is you being hired to track down a pair of escaped slaves. And once you realize what's actually going on, and the whole thing with Fenris running away from from his Tevinter master,
Mm-hmm.
the approach I'd go with instead is Fenris is Hawk going, as far as I'm concerned, I have his bill of sale now, so he's not your slave anymore, bitch.
Yep.
One way or another.
Possession is 9/10 of the law.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that does create a bit of awkwardness since now Fenris is still a slave and now in the employ of Hawk, but that's the kind of tension that you can build a story around.
Look, I've done that with one of my tabletop groups before where I needed to introduce a new player and we just had him come in as a slave that ended up under ownership, air quotes, of the party. So I'm entirely okay with going this route.
Yeah.
Good route. It helps to fill things out too.
Mm-hmm. And as the implication is that the arcane warrior stuff is done through his tattoos. I would go one step further and say that his tattoos allow him to phase.
Okay.
Which further emphasizes the whole the whole rogue thing, because I'd imagine in that phase mode he's a lot harder, if not impossible, to hit.
I would imagine he's pretty impossible to hit too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Especially since one of the cutscene kills he does is one of Sebastian Shaw's old tricks of, not Sebastian Shinobi Shaw, the asshole member of the Shaw family, of phasing through somebody and then making himself solid. But as far as Isabella, I'd honestly say Isabella would be the easiest one to work with. She is a captain who is trying to buy her ship back,
Hmm.
and is going along mostly because she finds all the trouble that Hawk gets into entertaining.
It's like, entertain me.
And now, if we wanted to keep like character classes balanced amongst everyone joining, it wouldn't be too hard, I think, to justify swapping Isabella over to Warrior if we've got Fenris as our rogue. This is just assuming we're trying to keep like a balanced number of classes.
Mm-hmm. Oh. When it comes to Meryl, I'd say the reason she ends Meryl seemed to be built around the concept of um innocence.
This is despite her being an absolute monster in combat.
An absolute monster in combat, and uses blood magic as well as messes around with forms of magic that really should not be messed with.
Just a little aside, just 'cause I don't know if some people realize how tough they actually made Meryl in that game. I fucked up a fight where I kind of got my ass kicked a bit more than I otherwise should have, moved forward, and it triggered the second fight before anyone recovered. I just kind of shrugged and went, I've just lost this fight. It happens. I'm not even doing anything with the controller. I look back at the screen in a minute and notice Meryl's at the bottom of the staircase just taking on the entire fight by herself. Like, why am I here?
Well, you're here because you're the main character.
I don't feel like the main character after watching that massacre.
Well, sometimes people are just there to inspire you to be better.
Well, when it now when it comes to Meryl, I'd say the reason that she ends up leaving the Dalish that she had grown up with is a case of wanting to, in her case, wanting to explore the world, because I think that the innocence thing can be brought in, but the narrative with her would be maintaining that innocence in a world like Kirkwall,
where everything is so worldly.
Mm-hmm. In that regard, she'd probably be not that far removed from Liliana. In the sense, Liliana strikes me as a warrior of faith.
Yes, Liliana was also she was struggling to reconcile her past as, a spy and an assassin for Orlais.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the cruel things she did in a very worldly part of the social circle, including her mistress, whom you can either use to make Liliana more innocent, or you can use to get Liliana in a foursome in the original game. That one was always a weird one. I'm like, why would you want to harden her and make it so that you fuck her ex-master and then kill her ex-master right after? Things are things. But Liliana had already she was already, I guess the best case would be cast out of the Garden of Eden. She had already been innocence lost.
Mm-hmm.
And was trying to find her way in the world, in the worldly world.
Yeah.
Whereas in this case, I don't think that's quite the same.
No, that's why I said that it's a roundabout sense. With her, she's because of her talents as a mage, she's never been exposed to the dangers of magic,
Mhm.
and sees as this wonderful thing, whereas a whole lot of other folks see magic as something that can be wonderful, but also dangerous if used carelessly.
Because, the fate is a thing.
Yeah. So when the reason why it's the shocking moment about her using blood magic is not the fact that she can use it, but that she can't comprehend the idea that there's something wrong with using it.
Because it's not because to her it's just another form of magic, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of naivete is endearing in some characters and terrifying in others.
Yeah.
And the implication with her is that it's terrifying.
But the key thing is that sort of innocence, almost making Meryl even more fey than elves usually are in fantasy settings.
Mm-hmm.
Not because but I'd make explicitly clear it's not a case of her being ignorant. It's just her perspective is such that she can't comprehend it.
Yeah, alien way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. And as far as Sebastian, I'm kind of 50-50 about whether we'd even include him in this because Sebastian was DLC. But the idea, but a lot of motifs with him I actually like. So I wouldn't be opposed to having him. The Putting aside the fact that I do enjoy that he had one of my favorite designs out of any of the cast. You know, scale armor, but using a bow.
Mm-hmm.
And there does seem to be an attempt to do the whole thing of somebody who is loyal to a cause, but also is struggling with their own personal vendettas, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of like what was going on with both Alistair and with Karth.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in his case, the conflict that Sebastian would have with this interpretation is one where he has to decide whether or not he's going to dedicate himself to being devoted to the Chantry or devoted to becoming king.
Which is almost exactly like Alistair being devoted to the Wardens or becoming king.
Yeah, the only main difference I'd go with this to make sure it's not completely retreading
Mm-hmm.
is he in his mind the being in the Chantry ended up saving him. Basically he's a less obnoxious version of a born again Christian.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that he feels that if he didn't leave the Chantry, he would have been stuck in a very decadent nobility. In other words, it hardened him.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I'd say it'd be a good idea to probably leave him in, if only because I don't know if there's really a character that you have that's that tightly tied to the Chantry, like you have someone like Anders, like on the opposing side of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also serves to be a kind of good counterpoint.
And to that end, since since there's the whole issue of apostasy, um, and given the fact that in this hypothetical, the Hawk that is the protagonist is I'd say should probably be the primary apostate, putting aside the whole thing with Anders. I honestly think Bethany should be the approach that we take with her is she was all set to go to the tower to study. Then the blight happened, and she was one of the people who got called up, which ended up reuniting her with her family anyways. So you can kind of have the half joke that that she was only a one-day member of the tower. Because just as she got settled in, all of a sudden the Grey Wardens need mages, and that included her. The main reason I'm saying that is because we have way too many apostate mages, and I'd like at least one that's at least leaning towards the approaches of the tower.
Yeah, that is distinctly missing in Dragon Age 2.
It was probably because of the polarity that the Circle of Mages had caused in Origins, to be honest. They probably wanted to lean away from all the Circle Mages. Especially considering Kirkwall, again, a mecca of civilization, it's going to have all sorts, including apostates.
Yeah. Well, when we get to Act 3, we'll be touching on the Circle of Magi, so it's good to at least have one person who has that perspective.
Yes, absolutely.
But as far as Varric, that's probably the easiest one to work with. I mean, there is very little that would have to change when it comes to Varric.
Well, that's because he's he's so easily likable, Monk.
I swear most of the time in character writing was just devoted to making Varric the most likable person in this game. He's easily the best part.
He has to be.
I have stated in the past that Varric is the best representative of a bard that you can get in video games.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I bring this up, people say, "But he doesn't play an instrument." Yeah, he does. It's his voice. He's not a singer, but he is a storyteller who
Oration.
You never know how much of his story is real and how much of it is bullshit, and he's not going to tell you. But I would say his particular opening of providing the impetus for the main story in Act 1 is a good enough reason for him to be kept around. And I should note one particular motif that I'd want to go is the framing device for a lot of these stories is in order to make a living, Hawk ends up setting up a merc company. A small time one that's basically doing odd jobs and the like as a way to facilitate a quest board within your base and give you a reason to be going all around Kirkwall.
In other words, Hawk is doing dirty deeds, done dirt cheap.
I still just hear to sheep.
I was gonna go with with the Dirty Jobs TV show, but that'll work too. And I ended up
Wait,
watching a
wait,
lot
wait.
of that when I was sick. Okay, don't judge me.
But we can't use dirty jobs, Monk, because then Hawk's name becomes dirty. Dirty jobs with Mike Hawk? Come on now. You ran right into that one!
Yes, I did, and I hate it. But the the other reason for that that kind of setup is I'd say by the start of Act 1 it's assumed that you've built up a fair few connections within the city, and you're able to use that to get work, whether it's escorting caravans or dealing with the slave issue. No job is too big or too small for the Hawk family.
That entire phrase after my dirty jobs joke just becomes phrasing, Monk.
Payback's a bitch, isn't it?
It's still you. You're setting yourself up here. I
You're
can just
the one who
continue to
thought of
say
it.
phrasing.
You're the one whose mind went to phrasing.
Escorting, no job too big or small. Come on now, Monk.
You said it, not me.
Fair, but still phrasing.
Boom, both barrels out.
So we have our Hawk family that now has a reputation of being able to perform any quest.
Yeah. And it's through that's how you end up developing your various connections. The main story is get enough gold to get Varric's brother to see you as a potential partner for his expedition. The only partner for his expedition, because everybody else thinks you're crazy trying to do this thing.
But you got to do this thing to help out your buddy.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that also includes getting the map to the deep roads, dealing with the Kunari. Getting the maps. That's a perfectly fine quest to build around. The whole thing with the Kunari, I'd say the approach I take is that in order to go into the deep roads for some parts, they need specialized forms of black powder, and the only people who have black powder are the people in the Kunari camp.
Go.
So you'd have to both prove your worth and prove that you're not going to misuse this shit.
Can't we just beat them up? The Kunari are kind of like Krogans that way, right?
Well, you could have it you could use one of their bigger guys as a boss fight. The approach that I'd have is at this early stage, even though you've gotten the chance to meet the Arishok, he sees you as beneath him.
I mean, he sees the entire world as beneath him, so that's not surprising.
Mm-hmm. And thus his approach is the approach that I'd go with in order to do this whole prove your worth for the black powder is if you demonstrate a understanding of the Qun, and at the very least are able to speak with him in a way that he's going to understand.
Hmm. I think the understanding of the Qun would be a little bit more important.
Yeah.
The Kunari place a lot of importance on that.
Mm-hmm. But moral, but moreover, um, there is the the one of the selling points that can be used it is the po- is whatever is sending them a share of whatever treasure is in the deep roads,
Mm-hmm.
which of course Varric's brother is going to be aghast at, but it's a case of if we're going to get the black powder, we got to play ball. And the when it comes to the actual expedition, this was another case where they tried to do the opportunity of killing off one of the siblings, which of course we're not doing. But I do
Yeah.
but the I do still want to keep the notion of finding the Lyrium idol and Bartrand backstabbing you over it. You know, this is where we see our first introduction to the whole red lyrium thing and how wrong it is.
Yep.
And in the in that in that in the vein of that, um, I would say that you do find another way out, as well as find the treasure. I'm not going to do that whole thing of the sibling gets the taint and has to be given a mercy killing. Because we already did that in the prologue. There's no need to do that twice. So the approach I'd end up taking is you get in, you manage to get a crap ton of treasure, and
Mm-hmm.
leading into Act 2, you use that to buy back the Hawk family house.
Among other things.
Mm-hmm. Now, this was where there was a bit of an issue of in the original game up until this, everything was leading towards doing that expedition. But afterwards, when you've essentially made it in town, there's the question of, well, what do you do now?
Mm-hmm.
Which the only reason you end up going along because you have fuck all else to do. So for Act 2, there needs to be I believe there needs to be something that builds around that you can build around as the driving force for that particular episode.
Mm-hmm.
So let's consider this. You're no longer slumming about in the bottom end of Kirkwall. You've by this point you've made by this point you have made it within the city. It's assumed that you've been in Kirkwall for about 4 years by now,
Mm-hmm.
and you're in a position where life is good. So we'd need to figure out, okay, how can we throw this on its head? I mean, I've got a few ideas. One of the ideas that I had is Hawk ends up dealing with an assassination attempt by people claiming to be Kunari. but when you approach the Arishok about it, he has no idea what you're talking about.
Which makes sense.
So the mystery is who put the hit on you, and why would they try and make it look like the Qunari did it? Which, if that seems a bit cliche, this is one of those cases where I'm grasping at straws.
I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea. Might need to be fleshed out a little bit more.
Well, that's
Maybe
good.
maybe some introductory missions for Act 2 that lead you through the updates over the last 4 years, but in a natural way. Including, what you've done for the Qun and what you've done for the Arishok, because you've probably worked with him over the last 4 years after the expedition and all that fun stuff. And so you have no reason to distrust the Arishok. So, like, the entire reason you eventually go to him after the hit is, hey, I need to let you know some people tried to kill me, and they claimed that they were Qunari. And, of course, the Arishok be like, what the fuck?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, I thought you needed to know. So you make it pretty clear that there's a good relationship at that point between the Hawk family and the Arishok.
Yeah. Now one of the big things is that the Qun are stuck there, but they won't they won't go into why, and they won't leave. In the originals, because Isabella had stolen a Qun artifact, and they have to get and because of its importance, they have to get it, and they can't go back. They can't go back home until they get it.
Mm-hmm.
Which I was always kind of iffy with that, because that means having to potentially throw one of your companions under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And that just doesn't sit with me. The approach I'd rather take is there's a few that can be taken. One is that for one reason or another they are missionaries. A group of missionaries led by the Arishok.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially is attempting to at least spread the word of the Qun, but every time they try and set something up, either the Viscount or Meredith shuts the whole thing down. But because of the fact that they got shipwrecked, they can't leave. But they're here to at least give people the pitch when it comes to the Qun. Which is why they're stuck there. In their mindset, all of the problems within Kirkwall could be solved if they follow the Qun. And instead of him I know it'd be tempting to have him be this stone-faced asshole because of what the Qun says. I would rather that it's less of him being an asshole and more of him being frustrated that no matter what he does, he's stonewalled.
Which should be an understandable reason to be frustrated.
He wants to help Kirkwall. He sees it as his duty to help those understand the Qun, to help people outside of it understand the Qun. He thinks that I'd say he is a good. It's a case of he's a good ruler who has been spending several years being stonewalled and frustrated at every single turn, and because of the fact that they can't I'd also take the approach of, because of the defenses that Kirkwall has, if they were to just build a new ship and leave, they'd end up getting shot at. Like set up something early on where they tried to leave, but Kirkwall is surrounded by these automatic defenses that were put up centuries ago. And when they try to leave, their ship gets shot at, and they barely make it back.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, because until we and they want to, in their mind, they'd want to try and meet up with the Viscount to try and see if he can shut down those defenses so they can leave at the very least. But he's not budging. As the theme with Act 2 seems to be that the relationships between the people of Kirkwall and the Kunari are starting to boil over. And
There's also a distinct lack of trust between the Viscount and the Vishock.
yeah, and
So if you need a justification for the Viscount not being so willing to shut down the defenses, is like, look, for all we know, these defenses go down. As you start to leave, there may be people that are going to start to come in.
yeah, this is a very chaotic area of Dragon Age's world. And because of that, I'd say a big reason that Kirkwall has been so successful is having that ancient defense system. So anytime anybody else in the free market sends armies to try and take over the place, they end up getting their ass kicked before they can even get to the gates.
Yeah. Also, potentially, even if it's not that he doesn't, even if he knows there's not going to be an incoming invasion immediately, there have been these Kunari that have been here for who knows how long. How much information do they have on how Kirkwall works?
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not an immediate evasion following shutting down the defenses, he's probably not comfortable risking giving the Kunari heads more information about Kirkwall.
And to that end, a lot of the quests end up dealing with people trying to, for one reason or another, accelerate the problem. Like rogue people in the Chantry trying to accelerate it, thinking that they'd be able to start a whole new crusade. Rogue Kuhn thinking that in doing this they would eliminate the problem. And right in the middle of it, the people who would be authorities on the matter, whether it be the Viscount, the Circle, or the Templars, for one reason or another, not getting involved. And as far as why they wouldn't get involved, as things start getting worse, as much as Meredith would want to, she's still answerable to the Chantry. And the Chantry is saying don't get involved. You could end up starting a war if we make the wrong move. If the Circle gets involved, then the Templars would look at that as the perfect excuse to do the rite of annulment. And the Viscount is just stuck between all of this and isn't able to figure out what the right decision to do is.
Especially with, his own paranoia about things that could possibly go wrong by just letting them leave.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on in that scenario.
And of course, until the assassination attempt, Hawk is like, look, that's all a bunch of politics shit. I want nothing to do with that. I'm just doing my work.
Someone forces Hawk's hand.
Yeah. And I would say Act 2 is the perfect spot to put in that one of the quests involves you getting rights to a mine. So not only do you have the family thing, but you're also getting into. The approach with Act 2 when it comes to Hawk is that they're successful enough that they're taking the treasure that they got and putting it into business.
So now the dirty deeds are done less, or less. They're doing more expensively. They're no longer dirt cheap.
Mm-hmm. both through the whole mercenary company thing and through basically taking a lot of people who are at the bottom end of Lowtown and saying, "Congratulations, you're hired for the Hawk Mining Company."
Those really are dirty deeds done dirt cheap.
Yeah, but essentially doing the business thing a bit, but paying a bit more fairly than other nobles would. Because
Yeah.
if the idea that Hawk is supposed to eventually be the champion of Kirkwall, it's best to have that kind of rapport built. That's kind of been the theme we dipped into in Act 1 and dipping more into in Act 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with all this said, it seems one of my coworkers isn't going to be able to make it in the morning. So I'm going to have an early day, so I'm going to go ahead and bounce now. Get some sleep.
All right, Monarch. Stay frosty, man.
Later.
So, moving into the climax of Act 2, I'd say this is where it's a case of we've had enough of it. We've had enough of this. We are going to see the era shock ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Which results in the era not the era shock, the Viscount, still in his paranoia, demanding that both the Guard and the Templars protect him. And this is where things go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you have full on fighting in the streets. Eventually Hawk finding them just as the Arishok has killed off the Viscount.
Oops.
As far as why he killed him, well, the Viscount tried to strike first. It was self-defense.
Yeah, because the Kuhn had no reason to attack him.
Mm-hmm. But when Meredith shows up during this whole thing, the approach that ends up happening is Meredith wants the Arishok dead for murder.
Mm-hmm.
And both sides realize that if that ends up happening, where a Templar ended up killing off a high-ranking member of the Kunari, well, word's going to travel fast, and that could make things worse.
Yeah, that's a war.
So the approach that's taken instead is he demands Hawk duel him, because his mindset is if this mercenary kills me, then then it can be something that's seen as an act of defense of the city, or the mercenary was hired to be a bodyguard or something like that. You can make up any kind of story.
Mm-hmm.
Because Hawk is not answerable to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And of course that ends up being a tough fight, but you do eventually win. And I would say with Act 3, because of the political situation, nobody else can take up the role of Arishok. Not of Arishok, of Viscount. I don't know why I keep mixing them up.
But they're both the leaders of their respective areas.
Yeah. Hawk for Act 3, Hawk is Viscount of Kirkwall.
Hmm.
And it's shortly after that you have the last time skip. Hawk is both the is Viscount, but also referred to as the Champion of Kirkwall.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because you've built up all that rapport from the last two acts or chapters, whichever you want to call it, and thus the idea of you becoming Viscount as the person who essentially helped quell things from getting worse. Well, that's going to put you into hero status in the eyes of most people.
Yeah.
But this is the reason why I called this particular act Faith and Fire is because this is where the issues between the Circle and the Templars start causing issues. The only reason that I wouldn't want to take the approach up. I know that sounds similar to Act 2 where you had two factions tensions reaching a boiling point.
Mm-hmm.
The approach I take in this case is both due to the red lyrium and due to her attitude. Meredith is trying to go full police state.
Mm-hmm.
Since in her mind, if it was that easy for the Kunari to put everyone on the defensive, then we need to shore up security needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And she had already had more political power than a Templar should have anyways. But because of this, even though in the original it was a two sides affair between the Templars and the Circle, in this case it's a three-way affair. You have on one side her Templars, on another
Mm-hmm.
side the Chantry, who's kind
Mm-hmm.
of who's kind of right in the middle of the whole thing, and on a third side the Circle, who view her actions as a Templar to be grossly offensive, and are actively pushing against her authority, to the point where whenever there's the demand to make a certain person tranquil, they are outright
Mm-hmm.
refusing.
Because there's usually no justification.
No justification aside from her thinking that somebody's a apostate in waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that she ended up going insane is blamed on the fact that somehow she found the lyrium idol and fashioned it into part of a sword, which is messing with her head.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be fine with it. I'd be fine with that approach, but not as extreme. It's You're basically dealing with any sort of sentient evil sword trope that you've seen throughout fantasy fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the only time you have a case where somebody picks up the evil sword and then they adopt a whole other personality is Nightmare in Soul Calibur, and I don't even know if I should count that.
Mm. I mean, it isn't just a Nightmare. Cervantes changed. Raphael changed. Anyone who picks up the Soul Edge changes.
Mm-hmm. I just had to go with Nightmare because that's
The quintessential. Yeah.
the quintessential and the biggest appearance-wise change.
Oh, yeah. No, that's... His appearance was like, what? I'm just going to metamorphose you entirely?
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to Meredith, I could see some scenes putting in where where she's in a room by herself and talking to somebody, but no, but it's not somebody we see.
Mm-hmm.
But but it is a and of course as Viscount you're stuck right in the middle of things where everybody wants you to pick a side. I'd also have it that by the time Act 3 comes around, um, because of the fact that they spent so many years in Kirkwall, some of the Cunari leave the Cune.
Mm-hmm. That cosmopolitan living got to them.
Mm-hmm. The mixture of cosmopolitan living and the fact that the Arashok is dead. In fact,
Yeah.
anybody who by that point anybody who was a devout follower of the Cune, after you become Viscount, you're able to shut down those defense systems and allow them to leave.
Yep. Finally sent the Kunari home.
So the only Cunari who are still around are the ones who voluntarily chose to stay,
Mm-hmm.
even if it means abandoning the Cune.
Few and far between, but still enough.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, because of this, a lot of even though you're still doing missions, any of the missions that you end up doing are on the behalf of one of the three, not one of the three factions, one of the main two, because the idea of Meredith contacting you to work with her on anything doesn't quite fit.
Yeah, she'd be paranoid against you too.
Especially since technically speaking, you're at the top of the food chain politically.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, I'd say that she'd probably try and have people take you out.
Not openly.
Not openly, or at the very least, she's looking for an excuse to declare you an apostate, and have you made tranquil.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the fact that you can't just do that to the most famous Viscount in the entire city, without political ramifications, she's stuck looking for an opening.
You'd have to do something awfully big for her to have the justification.
Mm-hmm. And because of that, the main there's three sources of quests when it comes to Act 3. Either one's from the Chantry, one's from the Circle, or one's from the people of Kirkwall.
Okay.
Because even at the top, you're still the man of the people.
And you still do dirty deeds, although this time they're bleeding expensive.
Yeah. But one of the I would say the way this kind of thing could be escalated is one is the is a the phylacteries, which for the longest time were stored in the command of the Chantry. They're now in the command of Meredith and her forces. So the approach so there's the issue of we've got two options. Option A, we take the phylacteries and we bring them back to the Chantry. Option B, which is what the Circle would want, we destroy them. Or we could do the approach of we try to take them, but in the middle of the fighting they get destroyed.
Yeah.
Which that which that ends up being an escalation point, because that whole thing of Anders blowing up the Chantry and killing the revered mother in the process was a stupid form of escalation, and and especially since it ends up happening no matter what your decisions are. Bit of foreshadowing. And completely destroys Anders' character. So the approach I'd take instead is that the destruction of those phylacteries, which is all of the ones that were associated with the circle in Kirkwall, they all that ends up meaning that one of the big advantages she had against the circle is now gone. And Meredith ends up using that as an excuse to try and get you labeled an apostate, and basically starts making her move.
Not a good idea on her part.
Not a good idea on her part, but she's not exactly of sound mind.
True.
The approach that the aftermath of this is what's essentially a mage temp. Two things end up happening. One, the Chantry completely refuses to recognize Meredith or her Templars as members of the Templar Order. They've been excommunicated now that she's pulled that stunt. And two, she starts declaring everybody a heretic, and starts waging war on the whole city.
Which is where the climax is really building to.
Yeah.
That war with the whole city.
Yeah, including her. I will say this. I think one way to make the red lyrium threatening is it is draining. Normally the way lyrium is used with Templars is a way to disrupt magic. In her case, any mage that she cuts with the thing, she's draining it, and and the sword gets more powerful as a result. Once again, I realize that's cliche, but you can't just say that red lyrium is dangerous and makes you crazy without giving it some sort of benefit as to why somebody would keep it around.
Exactly.
And the idea of using it as a literal mage killer is one way to do it. And if this sounds a bit too similar to, say, Stormbringer or the Soul Reaper, not the Soul Reaper, the Soul Reaver.
Freudian slip.
Once again, if you're gonna steal from the best. And
indeed.
Well, in both of those cases, you have a sword that drains life and gives it to the wielder, but at a cost. More so with Stormbringer than with Soul Reaver, mostly. I mean, in the first Soul Reaver, it was essentially a super weapon that you could only use at full health. In Soul Reaver 2, it was an instrumental part of a lot of the puzzle solving, but if you swung the sword too much, it would start draining your health.
Yep.
There wasn't really a downside to it in Blood Omen or Blood Omen 2. Although I try and forget Blood Omen 2 exists.
I liked Blood Omen 2.
And I don't think there was much in the way of a downside to it in Defiance.
I can't remember one. I'd have to replay it.
Yeah. But of course, the bigger point of inspiration with this is Stormbringer.
Yeah. I get where you're going with it.
And because of that, this is how you can have the eventual boss fight with Meredith. Essentially, have her create constructs of the mages and arcane warriors that she's taken out. You know,
Mhm.
a way to give her some kind of ads, so it's not necessarily a one-on-one fight.
Yeah.
And of course, in the aftermath, even though you ended up beating Meredith and destroying the Lyrium idol, it would be tempting to say that this ends up starting a civil war between the Templars and the Circles.
Mhm.
The approach that I'd rather take is, in the wake of two Civil War events, there have been a lot of dead in Kirkwall, and because of that, Kirkwall basically shuts itself off from the rest of the free marches to both heal and essentially reform both sides within it. Kirkwall essentially declares a kind of independent approach from the rest of the way things work throughout the world.
Mhm.
So do you remember when we talked about Civil War, and we talked about how the actual solution to the issue is proper training.
Yeah.
There is proper training when it comes to the Circle, but it's proper training in a gilded cage. The approach, both the remnants of the Templar Order and the Circle are reformed to not have as hostile a relationship.
Which makes sense. Having a hostile relationship between the two was always going to foment revolution.
Mm-hmm. Now, granted, it ends up causing a problem anyways because that approach creates a ripple effect where you end up having distrust between the Circles and the Templars anyways, which is the kind of thing that would lead into Inquisition, but unfortunately that's not the route that Inquisition took, much to my annoyance.
Yeah, let's not try rebuilding Inquisition the same night we're rebuilding Dragon Age 2, Monk.
I'm not going to. I'm just going to say how salty I am that you had a golden opportunity to focus on a civil war between the Circle of Magi and the Templar Order, and instead it's focused on rifts and elven gods
Mhm.
and a bunch of other stuff they tried to cram into one. And that and but I will only say if I'm reconstructing Inquisition, it would solely be about an Inquisitor trying to balance out this civil war going about. Eventually, you can have your big extra dimensional thing, but that's a third act thing. You know, much in the way that Warcraft and Starcraft had both its primary factions essentially declaring truce to deal with a bigger threat down the road.
Mhm.
Sometimes whether that be the Burning Legion or the Void, the fact of the matter is there's usually some sort of truce to deal with a larger threat.
Yeah.
And I
Makes a
don't.
lot of sense in universe as well.
But that is essentially the approach that we would take with reconstructing Dragon Age 2. This one, if it seems like we skimmed over a lot of the quests within the game, it's because it was important to trim a lot of the fat for this episodic approach, as well as the fact that a lot of the quests are useful in terms of the whole building rapport thing, but for the story part of it, that's not something that we can afford to focus on.
Yeah. You would need a lot of quests for the main story.
Mm-hmm. So, and that's going to do it for this particular episode of GeekWatch. We will be back here next week with another affair, and then over the next few days, I am going to be a very busy monk. But we will be back on live stream on Wednesday night because Paizo has released the first draft of their ORC license. So I think that's something worthy of discussion since it ties into the thing that a lot of people weren't talking about in the wake of the OGL fiasco. Everybody was talking about Wizards fuck-ups, but not a lot of people were talking about how the rest of the industry responded. And I've maintained that's the more interesting conversation.
Yeah, the rest of the industry responded, fuck you, we'll make our own with blackjack and hookers.
Mm-hmm. And since Chaosium has gotten on board with the ORC, this actually has teeth.
Yep.
So that's something that we'll be discussing. I want to try and see if I can get some more people on for it, but we will see.
Okay.
And of course, on Saturday, we'll be having a familiar friend in the temple once again. So until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk, and join the watch.